I woke up on Easter Sunday morning with a furry little head laying across my neck at 4 o'clock in the morning. My dog was wanting to go out, and so I took her out, and when we got out, like I said, it's 4 o'clock in the morning. It, of course, is dark out, but it's darker than normal. It was darker than normal, and the reason why is because there was storms coming through. We came back in, and a short time later, the thunder started, and the lightning started. The rain started pouring down. By the time that we got to dawn, about 6:30, it was still dark because the clouds were there. At about 7:30, I left from home to come to the church and to start getting ready for the morning services. And when I did, the clouds were starting to break up, and we ended up with this just absolutely gorgeous, beautiful day. Sometimes when you deal with weather and with the darkness, that last few hours before dawn really breaks can sometimes be the darkest. There's the old saying that the darkest time of night is just before the dawn, and that oftentimes is true. As we look at the story of the resurrection of Jesus, we need to kind of put it into a little place, because as you go through the Gospels, you'll see different stories, and sometimes it gets confusing because you'll see that there's this Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, and then there's this Mary and that Mary, and so you kind of get confused. And to kind of understand, we're going to be looking at the story of Mary Magdalene on Easter, on that first Easter Sunday. And to understand kind of the timeline of what happened, you have to understand, or to understand what happens in the story, you kind of have to understand a little bit of the timeline of how that first Easter Sunday began. Mary Magdalene and another Mary, who is referred to as Mary, the mother of Joseph, they start out to go to the tomb, and they're very, very early in the morning. It isn't dawn yet. A little bit later, there's another group of women that they start out to also coming to the tomb. And the reason they're coming there is because they wanted to finish the burial process that they didn't have time to prior to the oncoming Passover celebration. And so when the two Marys arrive at the tomb, what they found is that the stone had rolled away. Their immediate assumption is that something really bad has happened, that this is some sort of an act of malice carried out by the same people who were responsible for the execution of Jesus. And so Mary Magdalene goes to report what's happened to the disciples, to the 12 apostles, who are, or the 11 now, who are in hiding in the upper room. The other Mary goes to meet up with the other women and tell them what's happened. And so Mary Magdalene reaches Peter and John first and tells them what happened. And that's kind of the story that we're looking at this morning. Everything after that, the other reports of people who encountered Jesus, all happen after that. And so we'll begin looking here in the book of John, chapter 20, and just beginning at the very beginning, it says, "On the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early, while it was still dark. And she saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb, so she ran to Simon and Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said to them, 'They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him.'" So we're told something very important right here, and that is that it was still dark. Again, that's physically speaking, it was dark because it was before dawn. The sun had not started to rise yet when Mary starts out to the tomb. But it's not just dark in a physical sense. It's dark in an emotional sense. Jesus was incredibly important to these women. Obviously, they're there to come and to take care of his body. He's dead, and he was of such great importance, and it's emotionally devastating to them, the challenge at that time. But then on top of that, it's also a spiritually dark time, because they come in and they think, well, here's Jesus, and he's possibly the Messiah, and he's going to set up the kingdom, and he's going to make something really, really great. But now he's dead, and all of their hope for what could potentially happen seems to be gone. Of course, Mary Magdalene, we know that we're told elsewhere that the Lord had cast a number of demons out of her, and so she had this great gratitude, and Jesus was her spiritual mentor and spiritual leader, and now he's gone. And with it, with his death, all hope is gone. You see, fear and discouragement and pain, it has this ability to build on itself. You know, when you're afraid, things seem worse, and that leads to more discouragement. When you're in pain, when you're suffering, whether it's emotional or spiritual or physical, that can affect your attitude and your outlook on life. And that's what's happening with these women, with Mary especially. Her pain and sorrow is just building on itself, and it becomes very, very consuming. And that happens to everyone at some point in time in their lives. We all go through these times where it just seems that everything is breaking down. And that's how Mary is finding herself on that morning. And as such, she can't see what's happening around her. See, she gets to the tomb, and the stone is rolled away. And the idea that something miraculous has happened, that God has done something amazing, it never occurs to her. Why? Because these things don't happen. See, our ability to see God at work can easily become very diminished in the dark times of life. When the sorrow comes, when fear is prevalent, when discouragement is there, our ability to see what God is doing becomes diminished. And the reason why is because God rarely puts up a big billboard type sign saying, look at what I'm doing here, I'm at work. You know, we've driven past construction sites and we've seen this is the future home of such and such hotel or such and such business, or this new housing development. God doesn't do that. God normally works in ways that you have to look for it to see his work. And when our pain and when our suffering and when our fear and discouragement builds up, it clouds our vision. It can easily cloud our vision. And that's kind of an important thing to understand about what's happening with Mary in this story and what happens to us as well. And then you skip down to verse number 11, and in the interim between where we left off there in verse 2 and verse 11, Mary gets back to Peter and John, tells them what happens, and they come and they come to the tomb, and John is the first to arrive there. They're running, but the other two are not so far behind that they're unaware of what happens. But John comes and he looks into the empty tomb, and he just sees the burial clothes of Jesus, nothing else. Peter comes and he rushes and goes right on into the tomb. And for him, he sees also the burial clothes. We're told that he also saw the face covering that was neatly folded. And then we're told something very interesting, that John sees the burial clothes, and he believes that something miraculous has happened. He doesn't fully know and understand what has happened, but he believes that something has happened that is miraculous. Peter sees it, and he's confused. He doesn't know what's happened. He just knows that something strange is going on, and he has no explanation for it. He's not convinced that it's anything miraculous. He just doesn't know. And then you come to this next section in this story, and as I was studying, as I was preparing for this, I saw something in this that I've read this passage I don't know how many times through the years, but I saw something new. I saw something different that I had never seen in my life. And I wonder if you'll take note of it as we look through. If not, don't worry, I'm going to actually point it out to you. But it says then, beginning in verse 11, "But Mary stood outside facing the tomb, crying." In other words, she stopped outside of the tomb while John looked in, while Peter went inside the tomb. They turn around and they leave. They just leave Mary there. It says, "But Mary stood outside facing the tomb, crying. And as she was crying, she stooped to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white sitting there, one at the head and one at the feet, where Jesus' body had been lying. And they said to her, 'Woman, why are you crying?' 'Because they've taken away my Lord,' she told them, 'and I don't know where they've put him.' And having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, though she did not know it was Jesus." Now, did you see that? Did you see what happened here? This is one of the first, most amazing things in this story to me. Because here's Mary. John has just looked into the tomb. He sees the empty burial clothes. Peter goes into the tomb. He sees the empty burial clothes and he sees the face covering. That's what they saw. Mary was there. Mary was present as they looked into the tomb, as Peter went into the tomb. She was there. But when she looks into the tomb, that's not what she sees. You see, Mary looks into the tomb and sees two angels in there. They literally were not there just a few moments before when Peter and John were there. They didn't come in while Mary was standing there. She didn't see them walk and enter into the tomb. They weren't there. John did not have a conversation with the angels. Peter didn't have a conversation with the angels. They weren't there in any physically visible way while Peter and John were there. Mary sees the angels. You see, Mary is so singularly focused on her grief and fear that she can't see what's happening around her. And in her mind, she had settled on the most logical conclusion that she could come to. And that was this, that Jesus had died. And people, despite the fact that having seen Jesus raise people from the dead, we know of at least 3 occasions in which he did. Despite having seen Jesus do that, the idea that Jesus would come back from the dead never occurred to her. Because after all, in the experience of Mary and in all of our experience, death is final. Death seems to be a final result of life. We don't expect to go to a cemetery and find the graves open and empty. We expect to find the cemetery peaceful, but everything in place. And so Mary has dismissed everything that's happening. This is called confirmation bias. And essentially what confirmation bias is, it is this psychological phenomenon that exists with people in which we settle on a conclusion. And then we accept any information that comes in that supports our conclusion, and we immediately reject any information that goes against our conclusion. This is why sometimes trying to argue with people or debate people can be so frustrating, because you can go up and you can cite all of the facts, all of the figures, all of the statistics, and you can point it out to them, and it's like it never gets through to them. It's like they never hear a word that you're saying. Because the facts don't matter. They have already reached their conclusion, and anything that goes against their conclusion, they're just going to reject. We all have this. This is Mary's confirmation bias. The angels weren't there. She doesn't acknowledge, she doesn't even, it doesn't register with her that, hey, they weren't there just a moment ago when Peter and John looked into the tomb. That never registers with her. The miraculous that's happening right in front of her face, she can't see. Because she's focused on herself at that moment. She's focused on her pain. She's focused on her grief. She's focused on her fear. And then Jesus appears. And she doesn't recognize Jesus. Again, because of her singular focus. Because she can't see past herself. And if we fail to look beyond ourselves, we're always going to miss Jesus. Just like when those events that happen around us, as we mentioned a moment ago, that when the dark times happen, when the storms of life come in, it's easy to focus just on that, and they can cause us to miss the other things that are happening around us, the way that God is at work around us. They also cause us to become very, very internally focused. And when that happens, it becomes so easy for us to miss Jesus, even when he's standing and literally staring us in the face. And so in verse 15, "Woman," Jesus said to her, "why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" And supposing he was the gardener, she replied, "Sir, if you've removed him, tell me where you've put him, and I will take him away." And Jesus said, "Mary." And turning around, she said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. "Don't cling to me," Jesus told her, "for I have not yet ascended to my Father. But go to the brothers and tell them that I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." And Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord," and she told them what he had said to her. Now it's important to understand that Jesus had not changed in physical appearance so much in his resurrection that he couldn't be identified by his disciples. You know, we don't fully understand the full extent of what the resurrected body of Jesus is like. In fact, Paul tells us that what we will be like is unclear in the resurrection after the glorification process. He says we don't understand except that we will be like Christ. The full extent of what that means is unclear. But we do know that Jesus could be recognized, that he had not physically changed so much. He still had the prints of the nails in his hands and feet. He still had the hole in his side from where he had been pierced by the spear. But Mary couldn't see it. And Jesus asked her this question. He says, "Woman, why are you crying?" Well, what do you expect someone to be doing in a cemetery? Usually if they're in the cemetery, they're not there because they're having a birthday party. They're there because something bad has happened, because someone has died, because it's a time of grief and of sorrow. Crying is natural at a cemetery. And so in some ways, the question of Jesus, it's the same. It's very similar to what the angels had asked just previously. The questions are designed to try and break through to Mary and say, "Mary, look around you, see what's happening around you," but Mary just won't. And so Jesus had to break through that wall, that confirmation bias, that prejudice that she had that people don't come back from the dead. And he does it by demonstrating to Mary who he was. She thinks he's the gardener. And Jesus speaks her name. The gardener wouldn't know what her name is. And it is at that point that she realizes something's changed. It is at that moment that for Mary, it ceases to be dark. And I don't mean that the sun has risen. I mean that her emotional sorrow, her emotional darkness, her spiritual darkness begins to lift, and the rays of hope and joy of what the Easter has come to be known as begins to dawn in her heart. And it's important to understand something here. In terms of Mary's circumstances at that moment, nothing had changed. Nothing had actually changed for Mary. She and the other disciples and the apostles, they were still in danger. They were still considered outcasts. They were still considered rebels, not necessarily in a political sense, but certainly in a religious sense. They were still derided. The same people who hated and had been responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus hated them too. Nothing really had changed. By the way, before Mary even started out to the tomb, Jesus had already had been raised from the dead. His resurrection didn't happen at that moment. It had happened earlier that morning. Jesus was still as much alive at that moment as he had been before. Nothing in Mary's circumstances actually changed after encountering Jesus. What did change is how she saw the world. In fact, it changed not just for Mary, she's the first that it begins to change with, but it begins to change with all of the other disciples as well. You see, all of the other disciples, as they begin to have their own encounters with the resurrected Jesus, their whole attitude changes. Remember, when Jesus was arrested 3 nights prior to this, all of the disciples, all 12 of the apostles, or excuse me, all 11, Judas had betrayed Jesus, the other 11 apostles had all took off running, scared for their own lives. They had all completely abandoned Jesus. Peter had denied Jesus. 40 days after the Passover, after the execution of Jesus, the crucifixion of Jesus, would come, 50 days after that would be Pentecost. Pentecost is the day of the empowerment of that church that Jesus had built, that he had organized. Peter would stand up that day after the entire church that Jesus had organized had been out preaching Jesus boldly throughout the entire city. Everyone they encountered, they said, "Let me tell you about Jesus. He's the Messiah, and he died, was buried, and was raised from the dead." And then Peter stands up and he preaches, and a short time after that, of course, Peter and John would heal the lame man by the temple. Another 5,000 would be saved that day, and that church would grow despite all the persecution, despite everything. Saul would come in, and a larger, full focus persecution would happen against the disciples and against the early churches. People would be arrested, people would be killed. Stephen would be the first martyr, and they still continued on and on and on. Their circumstances didn't change. In fact, their circumstances, if anything, got worse. But what changed is how they viewed the world. And you see, when we truly begin to see Jesus, when we truly begin to encounter him, and we understand how glorious it is to be in his presence, it's going to change how we view the world around us. And it doesn't matter what the circumstances are. It doesn't matter what's happening around us. How we approach the world will change, because we will have encountered the Christ. That's what's so important about Easter Sunday. That's what's so important about the Easter holiday. Is because those things that we had hoped for begin to be confirmed. Without Easter, then Jesus is just another person who died. With Easter, we have the confirmation that his sacrifice was complete, that his sacrifice was sufficient. In Easter, we see that there is victory over death, that death does not control, that death does not keep us down. Easter is the most pivotal moment in all of human history. Because with the resurrected Christ and the empty tomb, we know that the gospel message is true.